The envelope lay on the solicitor's table like something that had already decided the matter, cream-colored and sealed with a device in dark wax, and the rain pressed against the single window of Hartwell & Sons with the flat insistence of a creditor who has waited long enough. The room smelled of coal smoke and old paper and the particular sourness of a space where uncomfortable things are said politely. There were 3 chairs arranged around the table, and the arrangement had not been designed. The solicitor, Mr. Hartwell the younger, sat behind it with the envelope before him, and the 2 men flanking him occupied the chairs that had arms, and the one remaining chair, the one pulled slightly back, the one without arms, was the chair where Beatrice Ashford sat. She had not chosen it. No one had offered it. It had simply been the remaining chair, and she had taken it without comment and set her leather satchel across her knees, as though it were a lectern. She was 31 years old. She had been appraising estates and their contents for 9 years, first as her father's assistant and then as his successor, and she wore her dark hair pinned without ornament and her coat without apology, and she did not fidget. The men across the table had been talking for 4 minutes before acknowledging her presence, and she had used those 4 minutes to observe the room with the quiet thoroughness that her father had called the first instrument of the trade. There was a framed certificate on the wall, slightly crooked. There was a bookshelf with 3 volumes of Blackstones and a stack of periodicals that had not been moved since the previous year. There was a small oil painting above the fireplace, a landscape of no particular distinction, and its varnish had yellowed to amber in the manner of work done cheaply and left too long in close air. She noted it. She noted everything. It was not a habit she could easily suspend. Mr. Hartwell cleared his throat and said that the estate of Ravensmoor had been placed in trust following the late Lord Caversham's passing, and that the trust required a full inventory of the house contents before the sale could proceed. He looked, as he said this, at the 2 men, and not at Beatrice. One of the men was called Simons. He was the estate's land agent, and he smiled in the manner of a man who smiles to fill a space before cruelty arrives. The other man was the one whose name Hartwell had pronounced with a care that suggested both respect and a degree of wariness. Adrian Caversham, the late Lord's nephew, recently returned from 6 years on the continent, and now the executor of the estate. He was perhaps 35, and he had the controlled quiet of a person who has trained themselves out of visible reaction, and he had not yet looked directly at Beatrice. Hartwell said that the previous appraiser's report, compiled 18 months ago by a Mr. Gerald Finch, had placed the total value of the contents at £4,300. He said this was the figure the trust had been working from. He said that a second opinion had been requested, as was procedure, and that Miss Ashford had been engaged to provide it. Simon said pleasantly that it was a great deal of cold work for the winter season, all those rooms, all that old furniture, and he looked at Beatrice when he said it in the way a man looks at something he does not expect to trouble him. Adrian Caversham still had not looked at her. Beatrice said that she would require unrestricted access to the house, all outbuildings, all cellars, all storage, and that she would want the prior inventory held in reserve and not consulted during her work. Hartwell said that was somewhat irregular. Beatrice said that it was standard practice to avoid confirmation bias in a second assessment. There was a pause. It ran 3 full seconds past Comfort. Then Caversham, for the first time, turned his gaze toward her, and it was not the gaze she had expected. It was measuring, and it was not unkind, but it held nothing of welcome. He said that she would have what she needed. He said it the way a man says a thing he has decided to allow while reserving the right to retract the allowance if circumstances warranted. Beatrice held his look. She could feel Simons's smile at the edge of her attention, and she did not look at it. Hartwell slid the envelope across the table. The wax seal had already been broken. It had been broken, she noted, before she arrived. Ravensmoor was 7 miles northeast of the market town, and the road to it had not been well maintained. The hired cart that carried Beatrice and her trunk and her 2 cases of instruments bounced through frozen ruts and past bare stands of ash and oak that reached their fingers into a white February sky. And when the house finally appeared around a long curve of drive, it appeared all at once, the way a difficult problem sometimes does, suddenly and completely, without any preparatory glimpse. It was a large house in the Georgian manner. 3 stories of pale stone now grayed by weather and the slow accumulation of damp, its south-facing windows filmed with a winter that had not been answered by fire from within. The grounds on either side of the drive had been left to their own counsel for some years. The box hedging had grown outward and upward and lost its shape, and the gravel of the forecourt had admitted a crop of winter grass that grew in tufts between the stones, with the patient determination of things that have not been told they are unwelcome. The front steps had a crack along the 3rd tread. She marked it. The stone was sandstone, which meant the crack had been worsening since at least the last frost cycle, possibly longer. She stepped over it and knocked. The housekeeper who opened the door was called Mrs. Peel, and she was a woman of 60 or thereabouts with a spine like a fence post and a face that had decided long ago to express very little. She told Beatrice that the east wing was closed off and had been for 3 years, that the kitchens were in working order, that there was firewood enough for the main rooms, and that Mr. Simons had already visited twice that week. She said this last thing without inflection. Beatrice thanked her and asked to begin with the ground floor reception rooms. What she found there, in the hours that followed, was an inventory in miniature of a house that had once been cared for and had been allowed, incrementally and then rapidly, to cease being cared for. In the drawing room there were 4 painted chairs in the manner of Hepplewhite, their seat rails loose, their gilded cresting rails dulled, but their proportions intact and their timber sound beneath the neglect. There was a long case clock by a Lincolnshire maker whose name she recognized, its case in burr walnut, its hood carved with an acanthus detail that placed it firmly in the last quarter of the previous century. She opened the door of the case and looked at the movement. It had not been wound in months. In the dining room there was silver plate and a locked cabinet, and she took the measurements of each piece and noted the hallmarks through the glass, not touching until she had her gloves on, then running a thumb along the cartouche on the largest salver, and feeling the sharp relief of a mark she could read without magnification. She wrote the weight and the gauge and the maker's letters in her notebook in a column, and the column began to tell her something the previous report had not troubled to record. The pieces were heavier than Finch's inventory had listed them. Not by much, by enough. She did not say this to anyone. She put the notebook away and moved to the next room. The library held 240 volumes, and she counted them exactly, which took the better part of 2 hours, and the light of both the window and the small lantern she had brought from her case. Finch's report had listed the library at approximately 180 volumes of mixed quality. The words approximately and mixed quality together formed a small flag in the margin of her attention. An appraiser who wrote approximately in a library had not counted the books. She had counted every one. At 5 o'clock the light failed and she lit the second lantern and found, in the alcove behind the library door, a portrait. It was large, perhaps 4 feet by 3, in an overmantel frame of carved and gilded limewood that had been painted over in a later period with a dull brown paint. The subject was a woman in the dress of the late 17th century, her head turned 3/4 to the right, her expression carrying that quality of internal composure that the very best portrait painters were able to render, and the lesser ones only approximated. The canvas had been relined at some point, which told her it had been valued enough at one time to preserve. The paint layer was stable. She held the lantern close and examined the lower right corner, and found nothing there, no signature. She looked at the back. The stretcher bar bore no label, no inscription. But the ground preparation and the manner of the glazing, The particular layered warmth of the shadows in the face put her in mind of a school she knew well. She made a note. She made it precisely and without enthusiasm, because enthusiasm was not the tool required. The tool required was patience. She had been trained in patience before anything else. There are stories that cannot be told forward without first being told backward, and this is one of them, and so the narrator must step away from Ravensmoor and the cold library and the unsmiling portrait for a moment, because the reason Beatrice Ashford was able to stand in that alcove at 5 o'clock on a February afternoon and see what Gerald Finch had not seen is a reason that requires explaining. It begins in a workshop in a market town in the north of England, where her father, Thomas Ashford, had operated an appraisal and conservation practice for 30 years. The workshop smelled of turpentine and rabbit skin glue and the dry mineral dust of gesso, and Beatrice had grown up in it the way children grow up in places that are working environments rather than domestic ones, with a kind of absorbed competence that arrives not from instruction, but from years of proximity to careful work being done well. Thomas Ashford had been trained in the old manner, under an estate agent in York who had understood that an appraiser was only as good as his inventory, and that an inventory was only as good as its precision. He had taught his daughter to read a hallmark before she could read a sentence of prose, and to identify a furniture maker's hand by the proportions of a cabriole leg and the way a craftsman habitually shaped a pad foot, and to assess the ground preparation of a canvas by the color of its cracking. He had taught her to write a provenance in plain declarative sentences and to cite her evidence as she went, and never to write approximately or mixed quality in a report that bore her name. He had also taught her something he never said aloud, which she understood only after he was gone, that the value of a thing is not what it is told it is worth. It is what it actually is. Thomas Ashford had died when Beatrice was 22, of a lung complaint that had been worsening for 2 years, and that neither of them had named aloud with any precision, which was the one area of her life in which she permitted herself imprecision, because naming it would have made it true too soon. She had been with him when he died, and she had not wept until she was outside, and she had wept only once, and then she had come back inside and finished the provenance report she had been writing when it happened, because the work did not stop and he would have thought it right to finish it. She had taken over the practice with 37 active client relationships and a reputation for accuracy that was, in the world of appraisers, a form of currency. The difficulty was that she was 22, and she was a woman, and there were men in the field who were neither as careful nor as knowledgeable as she was, and who found this arrangement insulting to their sense of the natural order. She had not argued with them. She had continued to work, and her estimates had continued to be borne out by auction results and insurance adjusters' reports, and the quiet satisfaction of clients who had been given, for once, an accurate account of what they possessed. Over 9 years she had developed the specific instrument of her composure, the flat, attentive stillness of someone who has learned that the best answer to dismissal is the work itself, that accuracy will outlast the people who doubted it, and that patience is not a passive quality, but a form of readiness. She had been sent to Ravensmoor by a firm in London that had worked with her on 3 previous estates, and the brief had been straightforward. Inventory the contents, assess against the prior report, note discrepancies. It had seemed on its face like a matter of 3 weeks in a cold house. She did not yet know that Gerald Finch had been coming to Ravensmoor for 11 years, and that in those 11 years the discrepancies had not been accidents. The village of Wetherton stood at the bottom of the hill below Ravensmoor's drive, and Beatrice walked it each morning before beginning work, in the manner of a person who has learned that movement clarifies the mind before asking it to be still. The village received her with the specific hostility of a community that has arranged itself around a local power and is not immediately certain which way the new arrival sits in relation to that power. The woman who ran the post office closed her window when Beatrice approached it, not rudely, but 15 minutes before the posted closing time. The publican was cordial enough, but asked twice, in slightly different forms, who had engaged her and on whose authority. The blacksmith, a large, quiet man called Trent, who shod the estate's remaining horses, simply looked at her for a long time and then looked away. It was Simons they were measuring her against. She understood. Simons came to Weatherton twice a week and sat in the public house and laughed his particular laugh. And people found him easy in the way that people find easy someone who makes them feel included in a private arrangement. She had been in the house 4 days before she found the ally, and she found him in the place she had not yet looked, the old stable block at the east side of the house, where the estate's formal records had been stored in wooden crates since the previous lord's health had begun to fail. The man who was there when she opened the stable door was called Clement Rowe, and he was 81 years old and had been the estate's head gardener for 40 years before his body had decided to negotiate on that point, and he now spent his mornings in the stable block with the estate records and a small paraffin stove and what she understood, after 10 minutes of his company, to be a complete and unornamented memory of everything that had happened at Ravensmoor since he had first arrived at the age of 41. He was a small man, white-haired, with hands that had been shaped by decades of work into something more like roots than hands, and he looked at her satchel when she set it on the stable floor and said, flatly, "Finch never came out here." She said she had gathered that. He said, "He came the first year and the second." After that, Simons brought him the paperwork already written, and Finch signed it. Beatrice wrote nothing in her notebook while Rowe was talking. She waited until he had finished, and then she took it out and wrote 3 sentences. Rowe watched her write and then said, "The Caversham family had things worth more than 4,000 and change. I sorted the crates in the East Wing myself in 1904. I know what was there." She asked if he would be willing to work with her through the estate records. He said he was not doing anything else. He had the manner of a man who has been waiting for this specific question for a considerable time, and has made no particular effort to look as though he has. February gave way to March, and March to a cold first week of April, and in those weeks Beatrice worked her way through Ravensmoor room by room, and the notebook she had begun with grew to 4, and the 4 notebooks together constituted an account of a house that had been seen, in the previous 18 months, through the wrong eyes or the dishonest ones. The ground floor told its story first in the silver, then in the furniture, where 3 pieces Finch had listed as Victorian reproductions proved on close examination of their construction methods. The hand-cut dovetails, the riven rather than sawn secondary timbers, to be period originals of considerably greater value. The upper floors were less forthcoming but not silent. In the 3rd bedroom she found a chest of Chinese lacquer work that Finch had valued at £40, and she spent half a morning with it, examining the depth of the lacquer layers and the quality of the gilt decoration and the construction of the carcass, and wrote a figure in her notebook that was 3 times Finch's number, and conservative at that. Simons came to the house on a Thursday in the 2nd week of March, and found her in the library cross-referencing the volume count against a purchase ledger from 1887 that Clement Rowe had located in the stable block. Simons stood in the doorway and looked at the books arranged in their counted groups, and the notebook open on the library table, and said that it seemed a great deal of effort for what would likely confirm the earlier report. Beatrice said that she had not yet reached a conclusion. He said, still pleasantly, that Mr. Hartwell had mentioned the trust was hoping for a swift completion, that there were buyers interested, that the longer the inventory dragged on, the more complications tended to arise. Beatrice agreed that complications did tend to arise. Simons looked at her with the smile that was beginning to acquire an edge, and left. That evening she wrote a letter to the London firm, not reporting conclusions, not making accusations, but noting the discrepancy in the volume count, the weight discrepancies in the silver, the misclassification of the furniture pieces, and requesting that the firm hold the matter in confidence until her work was complete. She sealed it herself and walked it to the post office in Weatherton the following morning, and the woman behind the counter looked at the address and then at Beatrice and asked no questions at all. The first discrepancy in the records had been not one item but a pattern, and a pattern, Beatrice had been taught, was not a coincidence. A pattern was an argument. Adrian Caversham came to Ravensmoor on the second Tuesday of April with no prior notice, and entered the library where Beatrice was working to find her standing on a wooden step stool with a loupe to her eye, and a volume of what appeared to be early printed maps pressed carefully open on the table below her. He stood in the doorway as Simons had, but for different reasons and with a different quality of attention. She did not hear him for a moment, and then she did, and she stepped down from the stool and removed the loupe with the practiced economy of someone returning an instrument to its proper condition, and she said, without particular expression, that she had been expecting him since the letter to the London firm. He said he had not come because of the letter. She said that she believed him. He looked at the notebooks on the table, 4 of them now, and the purchase ledger from 1887, and the 2 reference volumes she had brought from her own library in Bradford. He said, "You have been thorough." It was not a compliment. It was an observation delivered with the same quality of reserve that the observation might have received had it been directed at a piece of machinery performing adequately. Beatrice said that thorough was the minimum the work required. He walked to the table and looked at the open volume of maps without touching it, and then looked at the notebooks, and then at her. He said, "What have you found?" It was not a question. She said that she had found sufficient discrepancies to suggest that the previous inventory was not merely incomplete, but structured. Caversham said nothing for a moment. Then he asked what she meant by structured. She said she meant that the undervaluations followed a consistent pattern across categories, that they were not the errors of an appraiser who was careless, but the choices of one who was deliberate. He sat down in the chair at the library table, the chair she used for working, and she did not reclaim it. She waited. He looked at the table surface and not at her and said, after a long time, that Finch had been recommended by Simons. She said she knew. He looked up then, and she was still standing in the same position, the loupe held loosely at her side, her face neither accusatory nor sympathetic, and she saw, for the first time, a quality in his expression that was not control. It was something closer to a man who has looked up from his own certainty and found the ground not quite where he expected it to be. She said she would have a complete report ready within 10 days. He said he would want to be present for the conclusions. She said that was reasonable. He left. He left without anything that could be called a softening, but also without anything that could be called dismissal, and she noted the difference with the same precise attention she brought to everything, set it in the appropriate column of her mind, and returned to the maps. Beatrice found the portrait again on a Wednesday morning in the 4th week of April, which is to say she had known where it was since the first evening, but she had not been ready for it until now, and readiness in her work was not a feeling but a condition reached by the accumulation of supporting evidence. She had spent 3 days in the previous week with the estate's probate records and the purchase accounts that Clement Rowe had produced from the stable crates, and she had found in the accounts for the year 1691 an entry in the hand of the then steward that read, "Portrait of the lady, paid to the painter's estate per arrangement," and a sum that even in the currency of that year was not inconsiderable. Finch's inventory listed the item as 1 framed oil portrait, subject unidentified, condition fair to poor, value nominal. He had written nominal. She had looked at the word nominal for a long time. Then she had gone back to her reference volumes and spent an evening with them, and arrived at a conclusion that she would not commit to print until she could support it with one more element of evidence, which was why she was now standing in the library alcove again, with the lantern and the loupe and a small hand mirror that allowed her to examine the surface of the canvas from a raking angle in the lamplight. The ground preparation was lead white, applied in the Northern European manner. The flesh tones were built up in layers, a warm underlayer, and then cooler glaze on glaze in the shadow areas. And the particular quality of the halftones, that gray-violet at the edge of the jaw, the way the eyelids were modeled with a single fine passage of paint rather than blended, was a manner she had studied in a published catalogue from an Edinburgh sale 11 years before. She had handled 2 paintings from that sale herself, one of them a small portrait of a man in a black coat, and she remembered the quality of the paint surface because it had been unlike anything else she had encountered, and the thing she was now looking at under lamplight in the Ravensmoor alcove had that same quality. She set the mirror down. She stood very still. The woman in the portrait looked back at her with the composed patience of a subject who has been waiting 300 years to be correctly identified. The painter whose hand had made this work had not been a painter of the second rank. He had not been a painter of the first rank either, in the common understanding of that phrase. He had been something more difficult to categorize, a painter who had been brought from the continent and had worked in England for fewer than 15 years, and whose surviving attributable works could be counted on both hands, and whose name, when spoken in the rooms of certain auction houses and certain museum collections, produced a particular silence. She wrote the name in her notebook. She wrote it carefully and with full support. Ground preparation, pigment handling, the specific treatment of the linen weave visible in the thin passages of paint at the upper canvas edge, the manner of glazing, the documented purchase entry of 1691. Then she went to find Clement Rowe. The catastrophe arrived on a Monday, which was not a day she would have chosen for it, though catastrophes are not particular about days. She had returned from Weatherton at mid-morning to find 2 things wrong simultaneously. The library door, which she kept locked, was standing open, and the 4th notebook was not on the table where she had left it. She walked through the room without touching anything, as she had been trained to do when encountering a scene that was not as it had been left, and she made a visual inventory of what was present, what was absent, and what had been moved. The 3 earlier notebooks were there. The reference volumes were there. The purchase ledger was there. Only the 4th notebook was gone, and the 4th notebook contained the full running tally of discrepancies, the documentation of the silver weight variances, the revised furniture valuations, the map volume analysis, and the detailed notes supporting her attribution of the portrait. She stood for a long time in the center of the library. Then she sat down at the table and wrote, from memory, every item she could recover, and she was able to recover most of them because she had been trained by a man who believed that the notebook was a second record, and the appraiser's mind the first. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping, and when she had written as much as she could recover, she took out the letter she had received that morning from the London firm, which had arrived in the same post as the one she had not yet opened, and she read it again. The London firm had, on the strength of her earlier letter, and without informing her, written to Mr. Hartwell, expressing concern about the prior inventory, and requesting that no sale proceed until the second appraisal was concluded. Hartwell had forwarded this letter to Simons. Simons had come to the house that morning during her absence. Mrs. Peel confirmed this, standing in the library doorway with her hands folded and her face doing what her face did, which was very little, and then she said, as a plain additional fact, that Mr. Simons had also taken a small wooden case from the study on the east corridor, the one kept locked, and that she had a key to that room, and had noticed the case was gone because she dusted the study on Mondays. Beatrice asked if Mrs. Peel had seen what was in the case. Mrs. Peel said she had seen into it once, the previous autumn, when the latch had been loose. Papers, she said, and a small leather book with a clasp. She said she had not touched them. Beatrice asked if Mrs. Peel would be willing to say so in front of a solicitor. Mrs. Peel said she had been saying things in front of solicitors since she was 40, and she did not find the prospect remarkable. It was that evening, while Beatrice was sitting with the recovered notes and the cold fireplace and the specific heaviness of a moment when things have gone as badly as they can go, that she heard the front door, and then steps in the corridor, and then Adrian Caversham was in the doorway of the library with the expression of a man who has received information while traveling and has made a calculation and driven 7 miles in the dark on its basis. He looked at her and he looked at the table and he said simply, "What did they take?" She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was the particular quality she had come to expect of him, and then he was quiet for a moment. And then he said that he had driven from town because Hartwell had sent him a message saying that Simons had formally withdrawn as a state agent, effective that afternoon, and had requested that the appraisal be suspended pending a review. She said that was interesting timing. He said he thought so too. He sat down across the table from her, and it was not the chair he had taken before. It was the chair at the end, the one beside hers, and he set his hands flat on the table and looked at her notes, the careful columns she had rebuilt from memory, and he was quiet for a long time, and in that quiet there was something she had not heard from him before, which was the particular sound of a man revising a premise he had held without examination. He said, "Is it recoverable?" She said, "The attribution is in the paint surface. No one can take that." He looked at the portrait, which she had moved from the alcove to the library table 2 days before, and he looked at the woman in the portrait, and he said, very quietly, that his uncle had told him the portrait was worthless. She said she knew. She said that was the first thing she had been told about this house, and it had been the first thing she had known was wrong. The reckoning did not announce itself. It came in the way that administrative conclusions come, through rooms that smelled of old paper, through documents laid in sequence on a table, through a silence that was not the silence of drama, but the silence of recorded fact, settling into its permanent position. It came across 3 days in the second week of May, in the offices of Hartwell and Sons, and Beatrice was present for all of it, seated this time at the main table, and not in the chair that had been pulled back, because Adrian Caversham had indicated her place at his right hand in the manner of a man who has stopped making a particular error and will not make it again. She had spent the 10 days before the meeting assembling what remained into a coherent sequence, working with Clement Rowe, who produced from the stable crates 2 further sets of purchase accounts that Simons had apparently not known existed, because they had been filed under the incorrect year by a previous steward and had never been catalogued. She had also worked with Mrs. Peel, who provided a sworn statement regarding the small locked case, and with a colleague in London who confirmed, on the basis of Beatrice's written technical description and a photograph taken by the estate's photographer, the attribution she had made to the portrait. The attribution held. It held with the particular solidity of a conclusion built from ground preparation analysis, pigment identification, and documented provenance, and it placed the portrait at a value that caused a brief, controlled silence in Hartwell the younger when Beatrice read it into the record. She had reconstructed the 4th notebook almost entirely. She had added to it the final discrepancy total across all categories of the inventory: silver, furniture, books, maps, the portrait, the lacquer chest, and 6 further items Finch had omitted entirely from his report, came to a figure that was not £4,300, but rather 11,040. And the difference between the 2 numbers was not the difference between a careful estimate and a careless one, but the difference between an honest account and a theft conducted across 11 years through the mechanism of false documentation. Simons was not present. Simons had sent a solicitor of his own, who offered 4 distinct positions over the course of the 3 days, and retreated from each in turn as Beatrice laid the corresponding document on the table, until the 4th position was a silence that his solicitor eventually broke by indicating that his client would not contest the formal complaint. There had been a moment, at the end of the 2nd day, when Caversham had looked at her across the table, with an expression she had not seen on his face before, and she had not named it. She had simply noted it, as she noted everything, and let it find its place. Hartwell, to his credit and perhaps his embarrassment, asked whether Beatrice wished to formalize an additional complaint against the supervision of the trust accounts, which would have extended the proceedings considerably and would have implicated parties beyond Simons. Beatrice said that what was in the record was sufficient. She had what she had come for, which was an accurate account of what the estate contained. She left the room before anyone else on the second afternoon, and she stood for a moment on the front step of Hartwell and Sons, and looked at the street, and Caversham came out after her and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then he said, quietly, that he owed her an apology. She said he had behaved correctly once he had information to act on. He said that was not quite what he meant. She looked at the street and said she understood what he meant, and that it was accepted. By late June, the Ravensmoor inventory was complete, filed, certified, and lodged with the trust, and the estate, which was not sold, because Adrian Caversham had elected to take it on rather than dispense with it, was under the care of a new agent appointed by the trust, and already in receipt of the first repairs the house had needed for some years. The crack on the front step had been cut out and repointed with a matching stone. The box hedging had been brought back to its proper shape, not fully. It would take 2 more seasons for that, but enough that the intention of it was clear. The portrait had been cleaned by a conservator Beatrice had engaged from York, a colleague she trusted with the patience the work required, and the cleaning had confirmed in the first session what the surface examination had already established, and by the third session the woman in the portrait had re-emerged into her full 300-year-old certainty of expression, her face turned 3/4 to the right, her composure the composure of a subject who has never doubted her value, and has not been proved wrong. She hung now in the entrance hall, above the fireplace in her original carved limewood frame, from which the later paint had been removed in the manner of a thing that had been covered without reason and was now again itself. Clement Rowe came to see her on the day she was rehung, and he stood before her for a long time without speaking, and then he said, as though he had been thinking it for some time, and had finally found the plainest words for it, "A thing is worth what it actually is." He had said something like it before, in the stable block in February, in fewer words even than these, and it had been the sentence she had measured the whole of the preceding work against. Adrian Caversham was there when the portrait went up, and he stood on the opposite side of Rowe and looked at the face in the portrait, and then he looked at Beatrice, who was standing back from the fireplace with her notebook in her hand and her eye going over the hang of the frame with the focused attention of someone checking a conclusion already known to be correct, and what he saw, she understood later, was what he had been failing to see since the cream-colored envelope with the broken seal had been slid across the table in February. Not stillness. Readiness. He crossed the entrance hall and stood beside her, and he said, in the tone he used when a thing had been decided, that he would require a second engagement, a full conservation assessment of the stable block archive and the East Wing contents, and that he hoped she would consider it. She looked at the portrait and then at him and said that she had already identified several items in the East Wing that merited attention. He said he had supposed she would have. She put the notebook away in her satchel, and he held the satchel strap while she buckled it closed, and his hand stayed where it was for a moment after the buckle was fastened, and she did not move away. Through the hall's high window the late June light came in broad and level, and the portrait's woman looked out at the room with her 300-year composure, and outside the window the box hedging stood in its recovered shape against the warm sky, and the house, which had been a neglected place and was now becoming a tended one, was quiet in the manner of a thing that has stopped arguing and begun. A thing is worth what it actually is. That sentence, plain as a doorstep, worn smooth by Clement Rowe's telling, was the sentence Beatrice had not known she had been living her whole working life by, until an old man in a stable block in February said it aloud, and she recognized it as her own. If you have stayed with this story to its end, then thank you, genuinely. This is the kind of narrative that asks for patience, and you gave it, and that is not a small thing. If something in Beatrice's work, her refusal to be loud about what she knew, her willingness to let the evidence speak, settled somewhere for you, I would be glad to hear it. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from today and what this story brought to mind. I read every one. If you would like to be here when the next story arrives, subscribing costs nothing and means everything to a channel like this one. And one last thing, before you go, have you ever known the true value of something before anyone else was willing to see it? That question, the one about knowing a thing's worth before the world consented to agree, had lived in Beatrice Ashford since she was perhaps 9 years old, and standing in her father's workshop watching him hold a small oval miniature to the light, with the same care another man might use to hold a bird that had come inside from the cold. She had asked him what it was, and he had said it was a likeness of someone's grandmother, and she had asked if it was valuable, and he had said that the woman in the miniature had been dead for 100 years, and her family had sold it as a trinket at a house clearance, and that the painter who had made it had signed it on the back with initials so small a person would have to want to find them in order to do so, and that it was worth considerably more than it had been sold for, and that this was frequently the condition of things that had not been looked at with sufficient care. He had set the miniature down on the workbench and looked at his daughter and said, with the particular patience he reserved for information he considered important, "A thing is worth what it actually is, not what it has been told it is." She had not understood at 9 what the difference was. She had spent the subsequent 22 years learning it. This was why, when Clement Rowe said those words in the stable block in February, she had recognized them as something older than his telling. He had arrived at the same sentence by a different road, which is the manner of aphorisms that are true. They surface in more than one life, because the ground they name is common ground, and the people who find them have usually paid for the finding. Rowe was in declining health by July, and he knew it with the same untroubled directness with which he knew most things, and he spent his mornings in the entrance hall more often now than in the stable block, seated in the chair that Mrs. Peel had placed for him, at an angle, where the light from the high window caught the portrait without glare. He and the woman in the portrait regarded each other with what Beatrice, passing through on a Tuesday morning with her satchel over her shoulder, could only describe as a mutual recognition. She asked him once, in early July, whether he had known there was something unusual about the portrait before she had identified it. He said that he had known since 1906 that it was not what Simons called it, because he had taken down the brown paint from the corner of the frame one afternoon and found the limewood carving underneath and recognized the quality of it, and had told the late lord, who had been interested for a day and then had not been well enough to pursue it. Beatrice asked why he had not told someone before. Rowe said he had been waiting for someone who would know what to do with the information. He said it in the flat, declarative way he said everything, without complaint and without drama, and Beatrice wrote nothing in her notebook because some things were not data and did not require recording. The East Wing assessment occupied the better part of July and the first 2 weeks of August, and it was in many respects the more interesting of the two investigations, because the East Wing had not been touched by Simons or Finch in any inventory, which meant that what was there was simply there, undisturbed and unmediated, a direct account of how a family accumulates over generations when no one is editing the accumulation. There were trunks of correspondence dating from the early Georgian period, tied with linen tape that had dried to the color of old bone. There were household accounts in a dozen different hands, some careful and some perfunctory, spanning 140 years. There were 4 further paintings in storage, rolled and wrapped, and 2 of them were of no particular consequence and 2 of them were not. and the not inconsequential ones Beatrice handled with the same deliberate, unhurried attention she brought to everything, unrolling them on the long table she had set up in the East Wing's central room with the windows open to the August air, wearing her white cotton gloves, using the loupe and the raking lamplight and the hand mirror, writing in the new notebook that had replaced the stolen fourth. The stable archive produced, under Roe's guidance and in 3 sessions across the first week of July, the documentary backbone that the investigation had been missing: original purchase records going back to 1740, inventories in multiple hands that constituted a long interrupted conversation about what the house had always contained, and a set of correspondence between the late lord and a London dealer in the years before his health failed that confirmed, without ambiguity, that the late lord had known Finch's inventories were running low and had inquired, and had been told by Simons that Finch was reliable and that London dealers were prone to overclaiming. Beatrice read this last letter 3 times, and then set it face down on the table, and the feeling she held for a moment before she turned it back over and transcribed it into the record was not anger exactly, and not satisfaction exactly, but the specific clear-eyed gravity of someone who has found the last piece of a proof she had been constructing for months, and now sees the whole of it laid out plain. Adrian Caversham came to Ravensmoor more regularly as July wore on, and the quality of his presence in the house changed in the gradual and undramatic way that things change when a person stops managing their own reactions and begins to simply have them. He had a habit, she noticed early. When he was thinking, he touched the second button of his coat with 2 fingers, and then released it, not fidgeting, more like checking a physical reference point. She observed it without remark. He had begun to observe her in return, though he did so in the manner of a man who has discovered he is doing something he did not decide to do, and has not yet determined whether to address this. He came to the East Wing on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of August, and stood at the door while she was unrolling the second of the not inconsequential paintings, and he did not speak until she had finished the unrolling, and had set the weights at the corners, and had made her first pass with the loupe. Then he said quietly that he had brought lunch, and indicated the basket he was carrying, and she looked up and looked at the basket, and then at him, and something in her that had been held at its accustomed careful distance moved, without permission, an inch or 2 closer. They ate at the end of the long table, with the August light coming through the opened windows and the smell of the grounds coming in with it, cut grass and dry earth and the particular warmth of a summer afternoon that has decided to be generous, and Caversham asked her to explain what she was looking for in the unrolled painting, and she did. In the plain technical language she used for everything, talking about imprimatura and pentimento and the behavior of lead white as it aged, and he listened the way he listened, without interruption, without the polite glaze that sometimes settled over people who had asked a question and found the answer longer than they had prepared for. He asked one question, a precise one, about how the age of a ground preparation could be distinguished from one period to another, and she answered it, and he considered the answer, and he said he had not understood before that the evidence was in the material itself, not in the documentation. She said that the documentation confirmed what the material already said. He said that seemed to him an important distinction. She said it was the only distinction that mattered. He looked at her then with the expression she had been noting for several weeks and declining to name, and he said that he had misjudged her, not her work, but her, and that he wished to say so plainly. She said he had said so already, in May, on the step of Hartwell and Sons. He said that what he had said in May had been less plain than this. She agreed that it had been. He touched the second button of his coat and released it, and she looked out at the window and the summer grounds and the recovered shape of the hedging, and she said, without looking at him, that she had found the house and its contents a remarkable assignment, and that she was glad she had not known beforehand what it would require of her, because the not knowing had perhaps made her braver than she would otherwise have been. He said, after a moment, that he thought she would have been equally brave. She said she was not certain of that. He said he was. It was the first time he had been certain of anything on her behalf rather than in spite of her, and she understood the difference, and she sat for a moment with that understanding in the warm August room, with the recovered paintings on the table between them, and she allowed it to settle. Clement Rowe died in the last week of September, in the room he had occupied in the estate's cottage row for 40 years, with Mrs. Peel and the village doctor present, and the house's old cat, a large gray animal of indeterminate age who appeared to belong to no one, and the premises equally, asleep at the foot of the bed in the manner of a creature conducting its own separate vigil. He had said, the afternoon before, that he thought Ravensmoor looked more itself than it had in 20 years, and that it was a good thing to see something return to what it was before it had been misrepresented. Mrs. Peel told Beatrice this 2 days later, standing in the kitchen with the same composed economy she brought to all communication, and Beatrice listened and thanked her and said nothing else for a moment, and then she said that she would see to the formal record of his work for the estate, if Mrs. Peel thought it appropriate, so that what he had contributed was documented rather than simply remembered. Mrs. Peel said that she thought he would have found that fitting. The gray cat appeared in the entrance hall the following morning and sat beneath the portrait and looked up at it, and Beatrice, coming through with her satchel on her way to the east wing, stopped and looked at the cat and at the portrait, and at the quality of the October light coming down from the high window across both of them, and she felt the specific weight of a sentence she had heard twice in her life, once from a dead man's mouth in a workshop in the north, and once from a dying man's mouth in a stable block in winter, and she understood that the sentence did not belong to either of them, that it was older than both of them, and that it would outlast her in turn. By October, the work was formally concluded, and the new inventory lodged and the estate in sufficiently good order that its continuation was no longer a matter of remediation, but of ordinary care. The final meeting at Hartwell and Sons was brief and without incident, and Beatrice signed the completed appraisal report, and Caversham signed beside it as executor, and the solicitor witnessed both, and noted that the trust's records were now comprehensively corrected for the period of the prior misrepresentation, and that the estate's insurance and probate assessments would be adjusted accordingly. Simons had by then removed himself to a northern city and was not spoken of. Finch had retired. The adjusted figures had been noted in the relevant official record, and the matter was closed in the administrative sense, which is the only sense that the law provides for, though Beatrice understood, walking out of Hartwell and Sons for the last time in the late October afternoon, that what had actually happened was not in any record. What had actually happened was a house finding its own level again, a long falsification meeting its correction, a woman standing in an alcove with a lantern and a loupe, and seeing clearly what she had been trained from childhood to see. Caversham walked out beside her, and they stood on the step in the October light, which was the low, clear light of a late season, and he said that he hoped she would come back to Ravensmoor, not on professional grounds, though he would have professional grounds manufactured if she required them. She looked at him with the look he had spent 8 months failing to name, and was beginning to be able to name, and she said that she would not require manufactured grounds. He said good. She said yes. The light came down the street at its low angle, and the air had in it the particular cold of a season turning properly into itself, and she put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the small notebook there, the current one, with its columns and its measured entries, and she thought of her father in his workshop holding the oval miniature to the light, and she thought of Rowe in his chair in the entrance hall regarding the portrait as though they were two things that had been waiting a long time to be in the same room. A thing is worth what it actually is, not what it has been told it is, what it actually is. If you have come this far, then you have given this story the time it asked for, and that is not nothing. I am grateful. If Beatrice's kind of patience, the patience of someone who does the work and trusts the evidence and waits for the world to catch up, spoke to something in you today, I would be glad to know. Leave a comment, tell me where in the world you are, and tell me what the story brought to mind. I read every one, and I mean that. If you would like to be here when the next story arrives, please subscribe. It is a small gesture and it keeps this going. And if you have a moment before you leave, have you ever held something at its true value when the world around you was certain it was worth far less?